Now, more of The Real Story with your host, Jeanne Ives.
Well, as my listeners know, I am very much in touch with what's going on in the military, as I have a son who's a Navy pilot. I have a son at West Point who will graduate this year. And as a veteran myself and numerous other veterans in my family, look, what's going on in the military matters. And it's quite unfortunate because it doesn't appear to be as important to the rest of the nation, where you have about 0.5% of all Americans who even have any association with the military whatsoever. But I got to tell you, there's literally big concerns for me and for many Americans about what happened in Jordan when you had 3 American servicemen killed and dozens wounded in a rogue drone attack that obviously came from an Iranian proxy. But when I heard about this incident, my first concern was we could not defend against a drone. The fact that these service members lost their lives because they were undefended really concerns me. So I've been waiting to have this expert on for a number of different topics related to the military, but I'm so happy to have Dakota Wood here in this conversation with me. He served America for 2 decades in the U.S. Marine Corps, and he's the Senior Research Fellow for the Defense Programs at the Heritage Foundation. His bio is extremely long, but what I think is important is that before joining Heritage, Mr. Wood served the U.S. Marine Corps Special Operations Command. In this capacity, he was responsible for advising the commander on strategic level guidance, policies, and operational concepts affecting the future employment of MARSOC forces, personally facilitated the development of a new concept for the integration of capabilities of Special Forces operations and forward deployed conventional forces. To me, that speaks to what we're doing. We have forward deployed conventional forces, and you've got 350 people sitting in Jordan in what appears to be now somewhat of an undefended position. So, Mr. Wood, if you could maybe give us some idea of how this happened and what the military, if anything, has done about it.
Yeah, well, sometimes the more simple something is, the more danger it is. So if you can eavesdrop through all kinds of electronic means, trying to collect intelligence, the counter to that is a handwritten note that you give to a trusted person and they get on a motorbike and deliver the thing. It's hard to intercept that, right? So just by way of talking about this Tower 22 facility in Jordan, if you're trying to maintain a fairly small footprint so that it's kept, relatively quiet and all, well, you tend to then avoid building that thing up with all the normal defensive measures that you would kind of think about, a base. So if you're going to have an air defense system, what is all the equipment and the trucks and the launchers and the people and the radars and stuff that go along with that to build this thing up? If you want something very quiet, it's a smaller group, a smaller presence on the ground, but less well defended. So there's this balance to be achieved relative to the mission of that location or the people who are there, political sensitivities in the region, logistical support, all that stuff. I mean, you get a very clear picture on that. But that does create then a vulnerability. So this base was supporting drone operations, U.S. drone operations. There has been some discussion about maybe confusion on a radar screen. Is this a U.S. drone coming back in for refueling or what have you, or is this something else? And, if you recall just from our history books, this was part of what made the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor so successful, is that some of the radar operators confused an incoming flight of American planes with what turned out to be a Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor and Henderson Airfield and some others. So there was a little bit of confusion, I think, on the ground there in Jordan. Second piece to this is complacency, which really is a national issue we're dealing with. If you don't think the dangers are actually lurking and you get used to your daily routine, then you start to dismiss or not even think about real security problems. How many times do you stop to get gas at the local gas station and you're not really keeping aware of somebody that might be wanting to try to carjack you, right? Or you're in a shopping mall, are you security conscious? So the same thing can happen in these operational settings where you've got a daily tempo, you're not in a combat zone. I mean, you're not in Syria or Western Iraq. You're in Jordan. So are you really hyper aware, and can you maintain that hyper awareness on a constant footing over an extended period of time? So you get complacency, you get sensitivities about the size of your footprint and operations, or diplomatic sensitivities, where Jordan does want to support and help the United States, but they're also having to deal with their local domestic opinions and the animations of populations that may be sympathetic to Islamic State or whomever it might be. So a lot of these things came together to result in the carnage that you just talked about. Over 40 people wounded, 3 dead. What's troubling even more is what has been the U.S. response.
Yes.
Right? So is there same complacency, risk aversion, political shenanigans going on in D.C. that it took a week to 10 days to do any kind of response, and the response that we have undertaken has been minimal at best. So it's not going to deter bad behavior. And to your point, we've had, 160, 170 attacks on U.S. forces in Syria, Western Iraq, and elsewhere. The Houthis are still firing missiles and drones at international shipping in the Red Sea. Iran continues to support all kinds of destructive behavior going on in the area. So it really calls into question attitude, U.S. military capability, and policies.
Well, I mean, so to that point, granted, the place that was attacked was in Jordan, but it was also at the intersection of Syria and Iraq. It wasn't that far away from those two borders. It was literally on the front lines of what is now a war, of drones and attacks. And so I just look at it and say they had 160 attacks pretty much previous to this.
Yeah, right.
They had to understand that there was a vulnerability there. Just because you're in Jordan doesn't mean that the Iranians are going to respect that territory and not go after it. And was there any command that was, reprimanded for this defensive posture? Or are we at a situation where we were depending on local security forces for this type of protection?
There is dependence on the locals to provide everything from perimeter security to the provision of food and water, right? So if you want to be wholly owned, doing everything yourself, that's a very large footprint. We had similar situations in our response to 9/11, where we secretly arranged to have bases in Pakistan and elsewhere that were supporting the initial operations into Afghanistan there in September, October, and November. Very, very quiet, but that meant that you had to depend on some of the locals, and you have security risks that come along with that. If you recall 1983, the bombing of the Marine barracks there in Beirut. So the guards had weapons, but they had no ammo in the weapons because the rules of engagement in the security posture, they were told not to be, so aggressive looking. Well, there are consequences, to that.
So, of course, we don't want to reveal our defensive mechanisms so that they could be, countered in any technical way. So we kind of keep quiet on that. I understand that. But do you get the sense that now the military is taking a different posture towards this particular threat, and that they are going to beef up defenses and or just pull our soldiers out of there? I mean, we can hit them anywhere we want with forces stationed on our aircraft carrier or elsewhere without actually being on the front lines like that and leaving folks vulnerable.
So I would say yes and no. We can certainly strike anywhere on the planet. And so all the tools that you talked about, precision guided munitions, B-1, B-2 bombers and all that. So we can do that. The challenge becomes knowing what to hit. Do you need to conduct a strike to collect intel? So, you've been tracking what Iran's doing from Iran through Iraq into Syria, provisioning people and support and leadership and munitions and all those sorts of things going on. So you kind of need to be there to know what's going on. And you do not want to be totally reliant on some kind of partner who might have their own agenda in feeding you false intel. So there is risk to having people on the ground, whether it's Army Special Forces in Western Africa, Americans that for a long time were in Afghanistan, these folks, 850 or so, I think, in Syria proper, 2,500 in Western Iraq. There is risk, but it gives you on the ground intel.
Okay, I see that light footprint because, the logistics line for anything big with like an ADA unit station there is going to be very that's going to actually cost a lot of money and effort. Okay, can we turn to something else here? Because another concern of mine is we just had the report again of 5 Marines killed in the helicopter incident in California. And this falls in the wake of, one Osprey accident after another. And that's where the force is going. They're going to the Ospreys. They're getting rid of the CODs, which is what my son flies, the C2. It's been in service for 60 years. And they are going back and they're pulling back every single C2 pilot that is currently trained because they need somebody to have the capability to reload and resupply the aircraft carriers when the Ospreys are grounded. And I just feel like we've got a real problem with our equipment at this stage and its reliability. What's happening on that front?
C2 Greyhound's awesome plane. You talk about age. I actually did a catapult shot off the USS Midway, a now retired aircraft carrier, in the summer of 1982 on a C2 Greyhound. So that's how long they've been in service, right? Yep. Let's go big and then small. The big picture is problematic with age of aircraft. The average age of an Air Force fighter is 30 years old. So an F-16 is older than the pilots flying them. Our aerial refueling aircraft are 60 years old. The B-52 has been in service for how many years now? 1950s, 1960s. So we have really old equipment. We demand extraordinary performance out of aircraft in general in an increasingly threatening environment. So with modern anti-air weapons, the ability of very capable radar systems to track anything that's flying in the air, it pushes you to extreme capabilities in the aircraft. The difference between an MV-22 Osprey and a helicopter is night and day. Helicopters have a limitation on how fast they can fly and how far they can go. So what an Osprey, the tilt rotor design, gives you is fixed wing aircraft speed with 1,000 to 1,200 mile range, but also the ability to land like a helicopter. The engineering required to do that is absolutely amazing. It had a terrible growth pattern in the early iterations. How do you fly this thing? The stresses, hydraulic lines, the pooling of various oils in the engine compartments and all that stuff. And they worked through all of that. But it's still an extraordinarily complicated system of mechanical linkages. And the Marine Corps has discovered what they think has been the most recent problem, and they're engineering a fix to that. We'll apply it to the large fleet and get that back in the air. The loss of these 5 Marines was in a CH-53 Echo heavy lift helicopter, so a different aircraft, but you still have a lot of heavy stresses, older airplanes. I think the things, the fleet averages something like 35 years on the 53 Echo. Its successor, the CH-53 Kilo, is almost ready for fielding, and so the Echoes will be replaced by the new helicopters. But this particular flight was going from southern Nevada down toward the San Diego, California area at night in very bad weather. So the cause of that crash is yet to be determined. Was it a mechanical failure? Was it a crew failure? Was it weather related? We don't know, but the loss of life is certainly an issue. Age of platforms is certainly an issue, and an expectation of perfect performance from extremely complicated aircraft is just something that introduces risk into that equation.
Well, I do remind folks that just the training is dangerous. Yeah. Wartime is wartime, but folks who are serving in the military, literally, as we have seen recently, are putting their lives at risk for what should be sort of low-level complications. You don't expect to be blown up by a drone when you're sitting in Jordan, a friendly country, and yet it happens. And you don't expect to just be on a training flight and you have a mechanical failure in your plane, because I do feel like our defense industry has to get this right. You cannot have this happening anymore. It's frightening to folks who have people, their loved ones serving in these capacities, to have a death because of a failure like that.
I agree. I just wanted to jump on that. The people we have are fantastic, but we're saddled in with very old gear a volatile funding, not consistent funding coming out of Congress, and extraordinary demands on the equipment. Our military today is half the size that it was during the Cold War, and yet we still use it about as much. So you're working crew, personnel, and equipment twice as much as you did in the past, and we don't keep pace with the need to replace that stuff. So it's a real problem that the public is not aware of.
Okay, one last point, because we are talking about personnel. The Navy is the only service to have just said that you do not need even the minimum of a GED to join the Navy. You still have to have a decent score on the ASVAB. However, we know based on recruiting goals, that is adjusted to get more folks in. Does this concern you?
It does. The Navy is now accepting more people in Category 4, which is the lowest tier of qualification for attributes and these sorts of things. The Navy last year raised the upper end of age limitations to 41 years old to join the Navy. So you can be 41 years old and enlist for the first time in the U.S. Navy as an E1 or an E2, right? So increasing the age, lowering the standards to get people through those recruiting office doors. Why is this such a problem? Because 3 out of 4 Americans between the ages of 17 and 24, that recruiting cohort, right, are ineligible for military service because of criminal records, substance abuse, mental and physical health problems, and obesity. 3 out of 4 Americans. The number who want to join is much, much smaller than that. The U.S. Army shrank by 33,000 soldiers last year alone. So they're the smallest army since the 1930s. At the end of the Cold War, almost 800,000 soldiers in the active component. By the end of this year, they'll be at 445,000. So this numbers game with people viewing service as something noble, that you want to serve your country, is really problematic. And it's leading the services then to adjust their standards just to keep people in.
And that is an indictment on our culture and Americanism, in my opinion. And America better wake up, because this is going to hurt us in the future. There's no doubt. We can't have a military of the 1930s. We know what happened when it came to trying to get geared up for World War II. He's Dakota Wood, served America for 2 decades in the U.S. Marine Corps and the Senior Research Fellow for Defense Programs at the Heritage Foundation. Mr. Wood, thank you so much for joining me on The Real Story. I really appreciate your insight.
This is my blessing. Thank you so much for having me on and bringing up such an important topic to your audience.